In the summer of 1978, a man from the State Agricultural Board drove into a dry valley in eastern Colorado with a truck full of contracts and a promise that sounded too good to ignore. His name was Daniel Reeves, and what he was offering wasn't just a loan, it was a shortcut. Low-interest financing, flexible repayment, equipment packages that could turn struggling ranch land into high-output operations almost overnight. Water systems, feed expansion, growth on a scale most ranchers in that valley had never seen before. He held the meeting at a small town hall just off the highway. 32 ranchers showed up. Men who had spent their lives fighting drought, thin margins, and unpredictable seasons, now staring at charts that showed their income doubling, even tripling within just a few years. The numbers were clean, the risk looked small, and the opportunity felt real. By the end of that night, almost every man in that room signed. Every man except one. He was sitting in the back row, quiet, older, didn't say much. He didn't look at the charts for long. He wasn't interested in the projections. He was doing something else entirely. He was doing the math. After the meeting ended, Daniel Reeves found him standing outside near an old pickup, looking out over a stretch of dry, cracked land that most people in that valley had already given up on. "You didn't sign," Reeves said. The man nodded. Then he asked one question. "Where does the system get its water 5 years from now?" Reeves hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because it wasn't in the presentation. The man didn't argue. He didn't warn anyone. He just shook his head once and walked away. That night, 31 ranchers took the easy loan. One man went home and started building something no one understood. 15 years later, he was the only one left.
If you respect stories about patience, discipline, and decisions that don't make sense until years later, consider subscribing. Because this isn't just about one rancher. It's about what happens when everyone follows the easy path and one man doesn't.
The valley sat between two low ridgelines in eastern Colorado, a stretch of land that looked unremarkable from a distance but demanded everything from the people who worked it. The soil was thin in places. The wind came hard in the spring. Rain didn't follow a schedule, and when it didn't come at all, the land didn't forgive you for it. Most of the ranchers in that valley ran cattle on wide, dry pastures. A few grew feed crops when the season allowed it. Nobody got rich out there, but if you were careful, if you managed your land instead of chasing it, you could survive. That had always been enough. Until the late 70s. That's when things started to change. New equipment started showing up, bigger operations, better-looking herds. A few early adopters of new systems began producing more than anyone thought possible on land that had always been considered average at best. The idea spread quickly. If you could push the land harder, if you could scale up just a little more, you didn't have to settle for surviving anymore. You could grow. Most of the ranchers in that valley were in their 30s and 40s. They had families to support, loans already on their books, and just enough success to believe that one good opportunity could change everything. And then that opportunity arrived. But there was one man who didn't see it that way. His name was Walter Hayes. He was 60 years old in 1978. He had been working that same stretch of land since he was a teenager, long before most of the other ranchers in that valley had taken over their own operations. Walter didn't run the biggest herd. He didn't have the newest equipment. Most of what he owned was paid off, repaired more times than it had been replaced, and used only as much as it needed to be. He didn't talk much either, but he watched everything. He knew which parts of his land held moisture longer after a storm. He knew where the grass recovered first after a dry season. He knew how far he could push his herd before the land pushed back. And more importantly, he knew that anything promising fast growth usually came with a cost that didn't show up right away. The other ranchers saw opportunity. Walter Hayes saw a question nobody else was asking yet, and he had no intention of ignoring it. The meeting was held 3 days later. Same town hall, same folding chairs, but this time no one was there just to listen. They were there to decide. Daniel Reeves stood at the front of the room with a stack of contracts, a projector humming behind him, and a series of charts that turned dry land into something that looked almost effortless. He walked them through it step by step. Upgraded water systems, expanded feed production, higher cattle capacity, faster turnover. The numbers were clean, almost too clean. A ranch that had been carrying 80 head could support 150, maybe more. Feed costs could be stabilized, output could be predicted, growth could be planned instead of hoped for. And the loan? Low interest, long-term, structured so the system would pay for itself within a few strong seasons. "You're not taking a risk," Reeves said calmly. "You're removing one." Men in that room leaned forward. Some of them started doing their own math. Others didn't need to. The numbers were already doing it for them. Within an hour, the mood had shifted. This wasn't an option anymore. It was the future. The contracts started moving row by row. Pens came out. Names went down, one after another. By the time the papers reached the back of the room, there was only one man left who hadn't signed. Walter Hayes sat still for a moment, the contract resting on his knee. He didn't read it twice. He didn't ask about the interest rate. He didn't question the projections. He was thinking about something else. When he finally stood up, the room had already begun to empty. Reeves caught up to him outside, near the gravel parking lot where a line of trucks sat under the fading evening light. "Mr. Hayes," he said, holding one of the contracts, "you didn't get a chance to sign." Walter looked out toward the dark stretch of land beyond the road. Then he asked, quietly, "What happens when everyone's running the same system and it stops working?" Frowned slightly. "The system is designed to be sustainable." Walter nodded once. "But what does it depend on?" There was a pause, just long enough to notice. Reeves started to answer, but the words didn't come as easily this time. Walter didn't wait. He handed the contract back. "I've made a living on what I can control. I'm not going to build one on what I can't." And with that, he walked to his truck, started the engine, and drove out of the lot. That night, 31 ranchers committed to the same future. Walter Hayes chose a different one.
The first 2 years didn't just meet expectations, they exceeded them. By the spring of 1980, the valley looked different. What had once been a stretch of uneven, dry pasture was now organized, controlled, and producing at a level most of those ranchers had never seen before. Water systems ran on schedule, feed production stabilized, cattle numbers increased across nearly every operation. Ranchers who had spent years managing limitations were suddenly managing output. The difference showed up fast. Trucks got newer, fences were rebuilt, storage expanded. For the first time in years, some of those families weren't just getting by, they were getting ahead. At the local supply yard, orders doubled within a single season. Feed deliveries became routine instead of occasional. Even the bank in the nearest town started extending more credit, confident that the valley had entered a new phase. Growth was no longer a risk, it was the expectation. And every part of that growth traced back to the same decision made in that town hall, the easy loan. By 1982, nearly every ranch in that valley had either expanded or was in the process of expanding. Some had doubled their herd. A few had tripled it. The numbers made sense. As long as the system held, the returns justified everything. That was the part no one questioned, because for a while, there was no reason to. Meanwhile, Walter Hayes's land hadn't changed at all. Same fences, same herd size, same slow rotation of grazing that he'd been using for decades. From a distance, his ranch looked like it had been left behind. And in a valley that was clearly moving forward, that stood out. People noticed. They didn't always say it to his face, but they said it everywhere else. At the feed store, at the co-op, at the diner just off the highway. Walter's still running that place like it's 1965.
He had his chance. Some people just don't want to grow. One afternoon in the summer of 1982, a group of ranchers stood outside the equipment yard watching a new delivery come in. Larger tanks, upgraded systems, everything designed to support even more expansion. Someone mentioned Walter. A man named Curtis Lang, who had expanded faster than most, leaned back against a truck and shook his head. "That land of his could be doing twice the numbers right now," he said. "Instead, he's letting it sit there like it's worth protecting." A few men laughed. "Give it a few years," Curtis added. "He'll either sell it or fall behind so far it won't matter." Nobody argued with him, because at that moment, everything he said looked true. The system was working, the growth was real, and the man who had refused to be part of it looked like he had made the wrong decision. Walter heard some of it. Not all, but enough. He didn't respond. He didn't defend himself. He just kept doing what he had always done, working his land, watching his numbers, and waiting. Because while everyone else was focused on how fast things were growing, Walter Hayes was still focused on how long they would last. While the rest of the valley was expanding outward, Walter Hayes started working inward. He didn't take on more land. He didn't increase his herd. He didn't install any of the new systems that had become standard across the county. Instead, he began changing something most people didn't even think about anymore: the way his land functioned. It started with water. Not the kind being pumped and distributed through large connected systems, but the kind that stayed, moved, and disappeared quietly beneath the surface. Walter had been watching the low end of his property for years, a narrow stretch where runoff collected after heavy rain, where the soil stayed darker a little longer, where the grass held on when the rest of the land started to fade. Most people would have called it uneven ground. Walter saw something else. He saw a pattern. In the early fall of 1982, while most ranchers were focused on scaling up for the next season, Walter brought out a shovel, a post hole digger, and a length of pipe. No crews, no contractors, no loans. Just time and observation. He began digging along that lower stretch of land, slowly, methodically, testing the soil layer by layer. Neighbors drove past and slowed down. Some stopped. "Walter, what are you doing?" "Looking for something that's already here," he replied. They didn't understand that answer. To them, the opportunity was obvious, and it wasn't in the ground. It was in the systems they were already using. "You know you could have had all this set up for you," one of them said, gesturing toward the larger operations across the valley. Walter wiped the dirt from his hands and nodded. "I know." "Then why do it the hard way?" He paused for a moment before answering. "Because the hard way is usually the one that stays." By the end of that season, Walter had done something no one else in that valley had bothered to try. He had built a small, independent water catchment and retention system using nothing more than grading, basic piping, and gravity. It wasn't large, it wasn't fast, and it didn't produce anything close to what the bigger systems were delivering. But it didn't depend on them either. The water that moved across his land stayed on his land. It soaked in instead of running off. It collected instead of disappearing. And over time, it changed something else: the soil. Walter adjusted his grazing patterns around it: shorter cycles, longer recovery. He let parts of the land rest when others would have pushed harder. From the outside, it looked like he was doing less. In reality, he was building something that didn't need constant input to survive. The valley kept growing, the systems kept expanding, and Walter Hayes kept working on something no one else believed mattered. A smaller system, a slower system, a system he controlled. And while others measured success by how much they could increase each year, Walter measured it by something far simpler: whether it would still be working 10 years later. By the winter of 1983, the difference between Walter Hayes and the rest of the valley had never been more visible. Across the ridge, operations were still expanding. More cattle, more feed, more output. Even in the colder months, the systems kept running, steady and predictable, carrying that same promise of growth into the next year. And for the first time, Walter allowed himself to question it. Not out loud, not to anyone else, just in the quiet moments. Early in the morning, before the sun came up, when the ground was still frozen and the air carried that sharp, dry stillness that made everything feel more permanent than it really was, he stood at the edge of his lower pasture, looking across his land, unchanged, controlled, steady. Then he looked beyond it, at everything that was moving faster, working harder, producing more. For a moment, it didn't look like discipline. It looked like hesitation, like he had stepped away from something that might have worked. That thought didn't stay long, but it stayed long enough to be honest. Walter wasn't stubborn. He wasn't afraid of change. If the numbers had made sense, he would have taken the offer like everyone else. But the numbers hadn't made sense, not the way they were being used, because no one had answered the only part that mattered. What happens when the system stops giving more than it takes? He looked back down at the section of land he had been working on. The soil there held moisture longer now. The grass recovered faster. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't impressive, but it was consistent. And consistency, to Walter Hayes, meant something most people had forgotten how to measure: control. He exhaled slowly, the cold air visible for a second before it disappeared. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. The doubt had done its job. It had asked the question. And once again, Walter had the same answer. If it depends on something I can't control, it's not mine.
By 1985, the valley had reached a level no one there had ever seen before. Production was at its peak. Herd sizes were higher than they had ever been. Feed was consistent. Output was predictable. And for a while, it felt like the uncertainty that had defined that land for decades had finally been solved. Ranchers who had once worried about dry seasons and thin margins were now planning years ahead, expanding again, upgrading again, pushing further. At the county office, reports showed steady increases across nearly every operation in the valley. From the outside, it didn't look like a risk anymore. It looked like progress. Curtis Lang was one of the most successful among them. He had doubled his herd within 4 years, upgraded every part of his operation, and in the fall of that year, he hosted a small gathering at his ranch, something between a celebration and a statement. New equipment lined the yard, trucks parked in rows. Men walked the property, looking at numbers that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. At one point, someone mentioned Walter Hayes. Curtis didn't hesitate. "He could have been right here with the rest of us," he said, gesturing across the land. "Same system, same numbers." A few heads nodded. "He chose not to," Curtis added. "That's on him." Later that evening, Walter drove past the property on his way back from town. He didn't stop, but he could see enough from the road. Lights on, people gathered, everything running at full capacity. For a moment, it didn't look temporary. It looked permanent, like the valley had figured something out that he hadn't, like the hard years were finally behind them. Walter slowed slightly as he passed, then kept driving. He didn't say anything, but for the first time since that meeting in 1978, the valley wasn't just ahead, it looked like it had already won.
The first sign wasn't dramatic. It didn't look like failure. It looked like adjustment. In the summer of 1986, a few ranchers started noticing that their systems weren't performing the same way they had the year before. Nothing major, just small differences. Water pressure that fluctuated more than usual. Feed output that didn't quite match projections. Pumps that ran longer to maintain the same levels. Most of them didn't think much of it. Systems wear down. That was expected. So they did what made sense. They compensated. Adjusted settings, ran things a little longer, invested a little more to keep everything consistent. It worked. At least, it looked like it did. The numbers didn't collapse, they just stopped improving. And in a valley that had grown used to constant increases, that felt like a temporary slowdown, not a warning. A few reports came through the county office that year. Technical assessments, efficiency reviews. Notes about resource strain and long-term output stability. They weren't urgent, they weren't framed as a problem, so they were filed, read briefly, and set aside. Walter Hayes read one of them, picked it up from the counter at the supply store, the same way he always did. He didn't take it home. He didn't need to. He stood there for a few minutes, scanning the numbers, tracing the patterns the same way he had years earlier. Then he set it back down. Nothing in the report surprised him. It wasn't new information, it was confirmation. The system hadn't failed, not yet, but for the first time, it had stopped giving more than it was taking. And that, to Walter, meant something very simple. The bill had started to come due. The shift didn't happen all at once. That's not how systems fail. They don't collapse in a single moment. They stretch, they compensate. They hold together just long enough to make you believe nothing is wrong. And then, they don't. By the spring of 1988, the changes that had started as small adjustments were becoming harder to ignore. Water systems that had once run smoothly now required constant monitoring. Pumps stayed on longer. Maintenance schedules tightened. Fuel costs crept upward, not dramatically, but consistently. At first, most ranchers treated it like a normal part of operating at a higher level. More output meant more input. That made sense. What didn't make sense was how quickly the balance started to shift. Systems that had once paid for themselves were now demanding more just to keep running. Margins narrowed, quietly, then faster. Feed production began to vary, not enough to panic anyone, but enough to notice. Yields that had been predictable for years started to fluctuate. Some seasons held steady, others didn't. And when they didn't, the systems didn't adjust. They pulled harder, more water, more energy, more cost. The response was the same across the valley. Invest more, upgrade again, fix the weak points, keep the system running, because stopping wasn't an option anymore. Too much depended on it. By 1989, the first real failures began to show, not across the entire valley, just in certain areas. A pump that couldn't maintain pressure, a section of land that stopped responding the way it used to, a ranch that had to scale back, not by choice, but because it couldn't sustain what it had built. People noticed, but they didn't call it collapse. They called it bad luck, or poor management, or temporary conditions, anything but what it actually was. Because admitting the real problem meant questioning the entire foundation they had built everything on, and no one wanted to do that. Walter Hayes didn't say anything. He didn't point it out. He didn't need to. He could see the pattern the same way he always had. What had once been a system that gave more than it took was now taking more than it gave. By the early 90s, the difference between the ranches had become impossible to ignore. Operations that had expanded the fastest were now under the most pressure. Debt that had once been manageable was now constant. Costs didn't come in waves anymore. They stayed. Every season required more just to maintain the same output, and sometimes even that wasn't enough. Some ranchers tried to scale back, reduce herd size, cut operating costs, but the systems they had built weren't designed for less. They were designed for growth, and without growth, they struggled to function at all. That was the part no one had planned for, the part that hadn't been in the charts. Meanwhile, Walter's land continued the same way it always had. No sudden increase, no dramatic decline, just steady output, controlled input, and a system that didn't need to be pushed harder each year to survive. It didn't look impressive, it never had, but it didn't depend on anything outside of what his land could naturally support, and that difference was becoming everything. By the early 90s, several ranches in the valley were no longer operating at the level they had reached just a few years earlier. Some had cut back significantly, others were holding on, but just barely. The growth that had once defined the valley was gone. In its place was something quieter, heavier, a constant effort to maintain something that no longer sustained itself. Walter noticed something else too, something no report had mentioned, something no one had calculated. The land itself was changing. Areas that had been pushed the hardest weren't recovering the same way. Grass didn't return as quickly. Soil didn't hold moisture as long.
The system hadn't just taken from the operation, it had taken from the land beneath it. And, unlike money, that wasn't something you could borrow back. The collapse wasn't loud. There was no single moment when everything stopped, just a series of seasons that got harder instead of easier, more expensive instead of more profitable, more demanding instead of more productive, until one day the question wasn't how much more they could grow, it was how much longer they could hold on. Walter Hayes had asked that question 14 years earlier. No one had answered it then. Now, everyone was living it.
The summer of 1993 was the one no one in that valley forgot. It wasn't the hottest year, it wasn't the driest, but it was the year everything finally caught up. By mid-July, most of the larger operations were running at their limits. Systems that had been stretched for years were now operating almost constantly just to maintain what little consistency remained. Fuel costs were high, maintenance never stopped, and for the first time since that meeting in 1978, the numbers didn't just tighten, they broke. Feed production dropped sharply across several ranches, not gradually, suddenly. What had once been predictable was now unreliable. Sections of land that had carried heavy output for years simply stopped responding. No matter how much was put in, the return wasn't there anymore. And when the return disappears, everything built on top of it starts to collapse. Walter Hayes noticed the change early. He always did, but he didn't expect what came next. It was just after sunrise when he heard the first truck, then another, and then a third. He stepped out onto the porch, looking toward the dirt road that led across his property. 3 pickups came into view, moving slower than usual, spaced apart like they weren't sure how close they should be. He recognized them immediately. Curtis Lang, Evan Miller, Tom Grady. 3 of the largest operations in the valley. 3 of the same men who had stood outside the equipment yard years earlier talking about how far behind he was. The trucks pulled up and stopped near the edge of his lower pasture. No one got out right away. For a moment, everything was quiet. Then Curtis opened his door and stepped down, followed by the others. They walked toward Walter slowly, not with the confidence they used to carry, but with something else, something heavier. Curtis stopped a few feet away. He didn't try to explain, didn't try to justify anything. "We're in trouble," he said. Walter didn't respond. He already knew. "Our feed's down," Evan added, "lower than it's ever been." "We can't keep the herd where it is," Tom said. "Not like this." Curtis looked past Walter for a second, toward the lower stretch of land that still held its color, even this late into the summer, then back at him. "We need help." The words sat there, unfamiliar, heavy. For years, that valley had operated on growth, on confidence, on the idea that everything could be pushed a little further. Now those same men were standing in front of the one person who would refuse to follow them, asking for something they hadn't needed before. Walter looked at them for a long moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with the same steady expression he'd carried through all of it. "How many head?" he asked. Curtis hesitated. "Between the 3 of us, about 180. Walter nodded slowly. "That's more than this land is built to carry." "We know," Curtis said. "We're not asking for long-term, just enough to get through this season." Walter looked back across his pasture. The grass wasn't perfect, but it was there, consistent, alive, the result of years of restraint, not expansion. He could have said no. No one would have blamed him, but that wasn't how he worked. "You can rotate through," he said finally. "Small groups, short windows." The men nodded, relief showing in ways they didn't try to hide. "We'll pay whatever," Tom started. Walter shook his head. "I'm not selling it." They fell silent. Curtis went down for a moment, then back up. "We were wrong," he said quietly. Walter didn't answer that. He didn't need to, because the truth wasn't something that needed to be said anymore. It was something they were standing in. For the rest of that summer, trucks came and went across Walter Hayes' land, not in large numbers, not all at once, but steadily, carefully. Ranchers who had once measured success by how much they could expand now measured it by how much they could hold on to, and the one man who was seen as behind was the only one who still had something left to give. By the end of 1994, The valley no longer looked the way it had a decade earlier. The signs of growth were still there, but they weren't active anymore. Large systems stood in place, quiet now, maintained just enough to function, but no longer expanding, no longer pushing forward. Some ranches had scaled back so much they barely resembled what they had once been. Others had changed hands entirely. Operations that had once been models of success were now examples of something else, something heavier, something no one talked about openly, the cost of getting it wrong. Curtis Lang was one of the few who managed to hold on to his land, but not in the way he had planned. By the fall, his herd had been reduced by nearly half. The expansion he had built over years had been cut back to something closer to what he had started with, only now it came with debt that hadn't existed before. He stood one evening at the edge of his property, looking across land that had once carried more than he thought possible. Now it carried less, and even that took more effort than it used to. Evan Miller sold his operation that same year, couldn't sustain it. Too much tied into a system that no longer worked the way it had when he built it. Tom Grady held on a little longer, but by 1995, his ranch had been leased out to cover what he couldn't maintain himself. The valley adjusted, quietly, without the celebrations that had marked its rise. Meanwhile, Walter Hayes's land looked almost unchanged. That was the part that stood out the most. Not growth, not expansion, consistency. His herd size remained steady. His land continued to produce within the limits he had always respected. The system he had built, slowly, without loans, without outside dependence, did exactly what it was designed to do. It lasted. There were no dramatic victories, no announcements, no moment where anyone stood up and declared him right. That wasn't how it worked, because the outcome had already made the point. Every decision made in that room back in 1978 had led somewhere. Some led forward, some led back, and one led nowhere at all. Walter didn't gain more land. He didn't take over the valley. He didn't need to, because what he kept mattered more than what others had lost. Control, stability, independence. Things that didn't show up in charts, things that couldn't be scaled quickly. But once they were gone, they couldn't be rebuilt the same way. One afternoon, a young rancher, new to the valley too, young to remember what it had looked like in the early years, stood near Walter's fence line, watching the slow movement of cattle across ground that still held its shape. "Why didn't you ever expand?" he asked. Walter rested his arms on the fence for a moment before answering. "Because I wasn't trying to win fast," he said. He looked out across his land. "I was trying not to lose." The valley had chased growth. Walter Hayes had chosen something else. And in the end, that choice was the difference between building something that worked and building something that lasted.
Years passed. The valley never returned to what it had been in the early 80s. The growth slowed, then stopped, and eventually it settled into something quieter, more careful, more aware of limits that had once been ignored. New ranchers came in. Some learned from what had happened. Others didn't. That part never really changes. Walter Hayes kept working the same land the same way. No expansion, no shortcuts, just steady ground that still gave back what it was built to give. He passed it on later, not as the biggest operation in the valley, but as one of the few that had never needed to be rebuilt. And long after the systems that promised everything had faded into the background, his land was still there, still working, still holding. Because in the end, it wasn't the ranch that grew the fastest that survived. It was the one that never depended on anything it couldn't control.